So we are here to talk about AI in scholarly publishing. I thought it would be fun to do a sort of retro of AI themes discussed during Peer Review Week, which happened last week. The theme was Rethinking Peer Review in the AI Era, and also just sort of hot takes on AI conversations at conferences this year, because I know that you went to a bunch of conferences this year, Brian, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of get your take on some of the learnings that you accumulated from that, and just kind of interesting questions that you want to explore based on the conversations. And I will pause quickly to introduce us just for people tuning in. So my name is Danielle. I head up marketing and community development at Scholastica, and I'm here with Brian Cody, Scholastica's CEO and co-founder, for a quick conversation about AI and publishing based on everything happening this year. So welcome, Brian. Thanks for taking the time.
Of course, my pleasure.
So to kick off the conversation, I thought it would be fun to start with kind of a broad question. I'm curious, what surprised you the most in conversations about AI in peer review and publishing in general at conferences or during Peer Review Week?
Yeah, so this year, as you alluded to, I went to more conferences than I have in the past. EASE, ALPS, SSP, ISMTE, Peer Review Congress. And I think that what was very stark to me this year compared to last year was how much the conversation had shifted from, like if you look at I think the last 3 years of conferences, so 2 calendar years, it went from how is this going to ruin publishing to how are we creating tools to fight it? And I feel like this year the theme was what do we need to fight? And I think it was, that reflects a maturing of the conversation, but specifically, what do we need to fight? Meaning, yeah, assessing, well, what do we care about? What is the trade-off in, trying X tool or X approach? And I also think it reflected being more open to some of the benefits that AI might have at certain points, where 2 years ago it felt like very doomsday. Sort of this is all bad. And I think now there's sort of a mix of there are threats to scholarly sort of quality that come with this, but there's also potential improvements of scholarly quality or efficiency that can come with it. So that we can talk more about the specifics, but I think that was such a stark theme across this year, and really across like I was in North America, I was in Europe, talking to people from over the world. I think a lot of people that also reflected their experience with the conversations.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of going from the just idea of AI into actual implementation as the tools evolve, as people get more comfortable with them. And I know research integrity is such a big focus area in these conversations. It's sort of like AI is the problem and the solution or something. It's introducing new research integrity concerns. It could also be the way to solve the deluge of papers and technical checks and all of these things that editors are doing. But I know a lot of these tools are really nascent, and now is very much kind of like a period to try them out and determine what works and what doesn't carefully and thoughtfully, of course, for editorial teams, especially when it comes to peer review processes. So something I was curious about is, what can we learn from publisher pilots that you've heard of in terms of distinguishing the signal from the noise in AI research integrity checks? And just sort of like what are your thoughts on pilots in general as people start to, as we said, move from sort of thinking about these tools and talking about these tools to potentially trying them out?
Speaking with publishers, conferences, also, publishers we work with at Scholastica, I think that trajectory I was talking about before with the change in the conversation, part of that also is that I think even the idea of there are tools, I think people are thinking of this as, okay, I need that tool, right? And so uh, in RFPs, you would see people saying, we want to add this tool. Even if they weren't using it yet, they were sort of anticipating, well, I'm going to need that. It's sort of like, well, I'm building a house. I need some hammers. I need some screwdrivers, of course. And I think that as people have done pilots, all the outcomes are, well, first, these aren't like plug and play. Like these are things that have to be calibrated or fine-tuned for your particular like goal or like your corpus. I mean, there are some things like I think uh, duplicate images, maybe image manipulation that is probably on the gradient the closest to like, okay, this is something that is a more common problem that's not as specific across, say, like publishers. But a lot of the tools around scope check, ethical checks, looking at data sets, trying to look for LLM generated text. There's a lot of different problems that hit fields differently, and that the options out there, some of these different tools, you're going to get feedback from them. It doesn't give you a yes or no, it gives you a score. And that's one of the things that I think from the pilots, a lot of people have learned is most of these tools, and I think one of the ones, sort of in the space people are familiar with is Authenticate or Similarity Check, where it doesn't sort of give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. It gives you some data that can inform your decision, which is helpful. Well, similarly, a lot of these AI tools, they give you a reading, but you have to incorporate that into your decision tree. And I think for a lot of people, that reality of like both calibration and then, well, if I get a 67%, what does my team need to do with that? Or it's not green or red, I got a yellow. What do I do with that? And I think that both of those, the fact that these aren't off the shelf, just, you don't just add it. Again, it isn't just like click a button and now you have this. It's that you need to fine tune it. And then you also need to decide how your workflow is going to change based on the feedback you get. And so I think the cost benefit of different tools, because it can take time, I think there's a much more sophisticated conversation because people are saying, what would have been missed that we are now catching with these tools? But then
Mhm.
how much time are we spending either interpreting or incorporating those data, or um, finding that 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 amount of work might not be coming with a lot of added pieces, or might be missing things.
For sure. And I really enjoyed the ease session that you moderated on research integrity checks. I remember Kim Eggleton talking a lot about IOP publishing, like piloting different tools and just sort of having to decide like, where in the workflow should we use this tool? Do we have to run it on every single manuscript or just like a subset of manuscripts? How do we factor that in with like budgeting and all these things? And it's interesting because, it seems, as she said too, that there's just lots of different considerations of how to fit the tool into the workflow, even before you get to the point of using the tool. And then to your point, you have to train your team on how do we, interpret the results of this data, because it's not, it's not a yes, no, it's not a binary answer.
Well, and that also reminds me, right? You're talking with Kim. I think maybe it was the audience, but in one of those discussions at a conference, the issue of cost comes up. You say, when in the workflow, there's a reality, which is, right, if you have a lot of submissions coming in, running all of these tools, which have cost, and they have cost partially because, you're using these services that use a lot of data, right? And so there's a electricity cost behind this stuff.
Yeah.
So, when do you do it? Do you do it at submission? Do you do it, when to, after an initial technical check? Do you do it only sort of right before it's accepted? Do you do it during the, production phase to sort of make sure, nothing's bad? And there's pros, cons there. For some people, if they're really worried about getting enough reviewer, or sorry, that utilizing their reviewer resources well, they might want to run more of the stuff up front. But again, that increases the cost that they have. Um, and meaning to try and avoid sending something out to reviewers they might not want to. But again, especially for like smaller publishers, that might actually be cost prohibitive, and they're having to do that bang for the buck analysis of, well, how much are we catching if we don't do that? Versus, well, way back 3 years ago, how much bigger is some of these challenges or some of these threats around research integrity for our specific publisher? Because it might be other publishers, it's a huge problem for them trying to decide, well, how much is it versus, the money cost, the time cost, and then changing the workflow.
For sure. Yeah, it's definitely a lot of considerations. And kind of building off of that, I know there's been a lot of discussion around how to identify false positives or false flags from tools, as can happen. But there's also, this risk of silent failures. And I know you've mentioned that, we've talked about that before. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, on managing those situations, and again, like kind of any insights that you've garnered from conferences and peer review week and things like that.
Yeah, and I think this is a plus one, right, to some of the both, I think the case studies people are sharing at conferences, um, uh, during the peer review week sort of celebration. We read because I think now that some of these pilots have happened, people are again able to share results, not just sort of we're trying to figure this out. And one of the examples that comes to mind is at ISMT, there was a urology publisher who was talking about, they had a particular research integrity problem. They were using a tool and they ran, a couple hundred manuscripts through, knowing sort of which ones had problems.
Mm,
And what they sort of realized was at the end of it, they said, well, it had they were really worried about false negatives, right? It flagging stuff incorrectly, and they tuned that. But then they realized in that tuning there were more false positives, right? So things coming through without a flag that
mm,
specifically was okay, and that made them sort of pull back and say, okay, well, what, and this is back to the workflow discussion of where is this position in our workflow and how much trust are we giving this check? And so, for example, and I really appreciated the audience discussion at ISMT because part of it was, well, if you weren't going to, if a human was going to manually review these and was unlikely to catch things, if you wanted to catch 50, ideally, and you only catch five, but without the tools, you would have caught one. Well, it's still
mhm.
improvement.
Right.
I think your old way of, doing an initial manual check from a human would have caught 10, and this is going to catch 10, for example. Well, do you add those on? Do you layer them? Or do you say, well, the additional cost, and there was significant, some of this has significant cost, is that worth it? And so, but again, what I appreciate is the question of false positives highlights, and I keep thinking about, Cope's guidelines around this, where it's sort of the human intervention needs to not be supplanted by these tools, especially around decisions. So I think tools that can, flag things we might have missed or give additional data to sort of say, oh, you have a normal workflow, but this might want you to add extra, or sorry, doing another check here. I think is really helpful. But
Mhm.
when people are worried about things like, false positives, I think it's having them, correctly look and say, well, if we didn't have these tools, what time would we put into this? And if the tools can help us do, again, a more thorough check we might not have, then it's a win-win. If they're trusting it to replace a process, that is generally not panning, I think, out to be as helpful or as ripe a trajectory as some people were hoping a year ago.
And that's such a resource consideration, especially for smaller size publishers as well. It's like the tool isn't, at least at this point in time, it's not necessarily going to take over the human review, but that's not to say that it's not a time saving device. So yeah, it's interesting, like these different considerations of where does this fit in the workflow, and then to what extent and how is it going to save you time, but lots of opportunities to explore there. And I'm curious to talk about um, how you're thinking about um, like possible AI implementations at Scholastica based on industry learnings and customer feedback that we've been collecting over time. Because I know we're trying to have an ear to the ground of what customers actually need right now, the problems that they're trying to solve as these different tools evolve and emerge.
This comes up a lot when speaking with publishers and at conferences where, because this is you know, research integrity tools, but especially both AI detection, but AI assisted tools is such a rapidly emerging field. People are, of course, very interested in this. And one of our North Stars on this has been follow the publisher. That
Mhm.
as people are doing these tools, I mean, we've done a lot of assessments where we've said, okay, what does it take to implement this from a technical standpoint with, a third-party tool? But we want to see the publishers pay for it, start using it. A lot of times that's do a pilot. And I've spoken to multiple publishers where they've gone through that process and the end of it sort of said, well, it could be helpful there, but again, I think the clear or the ROI becomes less clear by the end of it. Or
Yeah.
again, and I think it's very different. There are publishers who either in a particular field or a particular scale are clearly reaping benefits from some of these research integrity tools. There are lots of publishers where it's less clear. They might not have been targeted by paper mills. They might have be in fields where image manipulation, the image aren't a major source of like either the data or sort of the methods check, and hence those tools are not as high a priority. And um, and so we've had people where we've done the technical assessment where they ultimately say, well, we don't, we're not going to use this. And so I also think in a lot of categories, of these research integrity tools, we're still so early. It's not like there's a lot of tried and true solutions.
Mm,
And so, for us, it's consistently talking to publishers about their experience, and reading these case studies like from Peer Review Week, people sharing what they've been doing, because that helps you get a sense of, okay, where are people really seeing traction and seeing value add? But I think all that is normal given we're so, again, this is changing so rapidly, this field and the tools available, and
mm,
also the data they're trying to sift through, especially when they're doing AI detection. It's an arms race that the content coming in is changing. So I
mm,
think that it's a healthy area where there's lots of pilots, and it's okay if lots of pilots turn out, oh, maybe that's not right, do more pilots, but also the tools. I think there are 4 to 6 month pilots that I feel bad for the vendors, because by the time they finish that pilot, their software might have actively changed and be better
mm.
than maybe the pilot would have shown, because things are changing so rapidly. So, but yeah, that's I really think our North Star is follow the publisher, and then to see what they want and need. And then we're also internally, the things we're developing, a lot of it is, problems that have, I think, clear feedback for editors that informs decisions without supplanting their decision. I think there's a lot of opportunity to, bring up, either information or help with tasks that are not related to the editorial decision but take up
Mm.
time. So
Yeah.
certain workflow steps can be automated. And so we see a lot of promise in that, and pieces we're developing.
For sure. And I know that one of the areas that we've gotten customer questions around, that is just kind of a big question in general, people are discussing. I know Cope recently had a forum that touched on this topic, is AI writing detection tools. Sort of questions around the necessity of them and the accuracy. And I know more recently there have been conversations around, are we going to have to move from a focus on detection to declarations as AI writing tools become more sort of ubiquitous in the day to day, and even kind of hidden, right? There's like AI tools in Google Docs, for example. Like people might not even be cognizant of like where AI is showing up in their life at this point in time. So I'm curious to hear like what your primary considerations are for publishers right now in that area. What are your thoughts on AI writing detection?
So one of the things, again, across conferences this year, there's been different examples that I'll summarize as, the ends of pilots boiling down to, okay, there's different tools that can identify AI writing,
Mm,
or say AI generated, content. When do we care?
right.
But one of the examples, a pilot they did is, going through trying to catch it very early with, for example, the abstract. Because again, there's cost, and the cost is going down, but at a certain volume, if you're sending a full manuscript versus, say, start with the abstract as a step one, and the problems arise, well, you stop there, and that way you're avoiding downstream
Mm,
costs and investment, right? So that was one of the pilots. And I thought it was really interesting is the end of it, they were able to fine tune it to get, a low false positive and a low false negative rate, and they felt very confident. But then they had this issue where they said, well, we're identifying AI generated content in these abstracts, but do we care? And I think compared to a year ago, that makes sense. A year ago, it was, this is bad. And
mm,
part of the discussion might be, well, is this actually saving us time? Especially if we have authors who are non-native English speakers publishing in English only journals,
mm,
it's actually saved time for, copy editing and other things, down the road. And so I think that that sort of question around when do we care
mm,
is really important. And I think that, you mentioned declarations. As we all know, that is very difficult, because or I think sorry, one of the same questions is coming up around declarations, which is, well, if they declare one thing and we think we've detected another, when do we need to escalate that with the author? Like that author relationship. If someone says, "Oh, I didn't use this," and we say, "Well, it looks like in your methods section we identified this."
mm,
To your point, if it was right, well, it was innocuous editing, or even like you said, maybe even, I mean, someone has a plugin and in the submission form it updates something. I mean, there's all these cases where thinking about that relationship with the author versus this flag being raised. I think we're getting to that point where the rubber meets the road is very much the discussion people are having in the industry day to day, which I think is healthy. But yeah, I think many publishers are having that discussion of when do we care, and then
mm.
on the challenge of what do we do if we find this problem, I talked to someone in an ethics department where they were having this challenge where the current rule was anytime something was detected, it went to their ethics department.
Mhm.
And they had to sort of say, create rules on the fly. Well, when do we address this with the author? When do we not? That was a huge amount of internal process to develop.
Mhm.
And by the end of it, they were saying, well, a lot of these we actually don't even need to come to us because that's just creating work. It's slowing down, time through peer review, time to decision.
Mhm.
Um, but again, because all this is changing so rapidly, I think that's a healthy place to be. It's not, I think churn in our processes right now is healthy. We're iterating and improving. Um,
Mhm.
Especially early adopters are going, that's going to be their reality, is they're going to be the ones figuring this out and trying things, having to figure it out. And then other people will be able to sort of follow those models.
For sure. Yeah, no, it's definitely an evolving time right now. And as a last question, real quickly, I'm curious if there's anything that you've been reading, watching, observing, whatever format around just AI in general that, yeah, that you want to share.
I don't know that I've been reading a lot. Well, sort of. So, again, I write code for a very small part of my time at Scholastica. And so I'm using a lot of AI tools around, writing code. And it's really interesting, 'cause especially things like writing tests. It can really make you way more productive and also help, if you're at a level, I think a lot of it's like if you're at sort of a manager level with any task, you can evaluate some of these LLMs and the output well versus if you're asking it to do something you don't know anything about. So like for code, where I can evaluate the code, I can evaluate the testing. That's really interesting to me. But then also third-party tools. So it's almost things. Think of it as outside your peer review process, but back office or even just operations. We're all doing stuff where every once in a while, oh, I got to copy a bunch of stuff from PDFs over to this web form to submit for whatever. Uh, Part of just being an organization that exists. And there's a lot of tools that can really help automate that. And so for me, trying to read a lot about what tools are emerging and use cases that almost have nothing to do with journals, but have just to do with taking things that are not interesting to humans and that you can also check well. And again, I'll give that example of taking things from a PDF like tables, putting it into a new table. Sometimes you have to do that for reporting. Being able to have LLMs help with that and then go back and check that. Say, okay, go to a different model, totally different model, and just say, given this output, compare it against these 5 PDFs, see if the output looks right. And I'm still going to view it myself, but all that, I can be answering emails while it's double checking and back to the sort of flagging. If it notices something wrong, one of these other models, I just got a huge benefit where I saved time making something, it caught an error, or for my own work, it catching an error I was doing. So reading blog posts, following LinkedIn, whenever people can share examples of, oh, this helped with this small task. I think we're in a zone where a lot of LLMs are very good for something that takes you time and you're an expert at. And I think part of the trick right now is to identify those in your day to day. I'm good at this, but it takes me time. I could have my LLM, intern do it for me and I can evaluate its output. So that's a lot of maybe what I'm reading that's relevant to the space.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I like the idea of thinking of your sort of AI assistant in those different possible situations. Well, thank you so much for taking the time for this quick chat. We're excited to share it with folks. And yeah, we'll be continuing to think about and talk about AI. So stay tuned for more Scholastica insights on the topic for sure. And we look forward to other people's continued insights as well. This conversation is certainly going to be going on for a very long time, I think.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you, Danielle. I really enjoyed it.
For sure. Thanks. Bye.